The crisp Manhattan morning bathed 6th Avenue in golden light as Jacob Reynolds eased his battered pickup truck to a stop along the pristine sidewalk bordering the Rowinson mansion. He exhaled slowly, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His dark hair now streaked with silver, the lines on his face etched by years of labor and quiet endurance. He ran a calloused hand through his hair, then grabbed his toolbox and portfolio from the passenger seat. At 37, Jacob carried the look of a man shaped by his craft. Handsome in a rugged, unpolished way, his sharp eyes holding the weight of experience, the burden of a life that had not always been kind. He cast a glance at the luxury sedans and sleek black town cars parked along the curb, a stark contrast to his aging truck, with its dented fender and faded paint. "Behave yourself," he muttered to the vehicle, slamming the door shut before stepping onto the sidewalk. The Rowinson mansion loomed before him like a monument to another era, 3 stories of weathered limestone standing defiantly amid the glass and steel high-rises that had come to dominate the city. Its arched windows, intricate cornices, and wrought iron balcony railings whispered of a time when wealth was old and status was inherited, not earned. It was the kind of house that carried secrets within its walls, the kind that made men like Jacob feel out of place. He rolled his shoulders, pushing past the familiar tension that came with stepping into a world that was never meant for him. 8 years of raising his daughter Zara on his own had taught him to swallow such feelings, to do the work and cash the check. Pride be damned. Before he could knock, the heavy oak door swung open. A woman, neatly pressed and exuding quiet authority, stood before him. "Mr. Reynolds, I presume," she said, her voice even, measured. "That's me," Jacob replied. "I'm Juliet Moore, the housekeeper. Mr. Peterson mentioned you'd be arriving to assess the restoration work." He nodded. "The east wing doors and some window frames, if I'm not mistaken." "Correct," she confirmed. "Mrs. Rowinson is entertaining guests in the garden and Mr. Kieran is resting. If you'll follow me, I'll have you wait in the main hall while I retrieve the house plans." She turned on her heel, leading him through the grand foyer, where polished marble reflected the light, filtering in through stained glass transoms. The scent of beeswax polish, aged leather, and something else, something indefinable, lingered in the air. Perhaps it was history itself, the residue of generations who had walked these same halls. "Please, wait here," Juliet instructed, gesturing toward an ornately carved bench against the wall. "I'll return shortly." Jacob set down his toolbox, adjusting the strap of his portfolio. As the housekeeper disappeared down the hall, he let his gaze wander across the opulent surroundings, the quiet hum of a distant grandfather clock, the faint sound of laughter drifting in from the garden, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the portraits lining the walls. Everything about this house felt like a world unto itself. And he was about to step deeper inside, left alone. Jacob's craftsman's eye immediately took in the space around him, the masterful woodwork that framed the room like a gallery of forgotten artistry. Hand-carved moldings, quarter-sawn oak paneling, intricate joinery that spoke of another era, a time when work was slow, deliberate, meant to last. His fingers twitched with the urge to run along the grain, to feel the stories embedded in the wood, the years of growth, the quiet resilience of nature shaped by human hands. And then he saw it. On the far wall, amid an elegant display of portraits and oil landscapes, one painting seemed to defy the light itself. Its presence was heavier than the others, as if it did not merely hang but commanded the space around it. Encased in an ornate black frame with delicate silver filigree, the portrait depicted a young woman cradling 2 newborns in her arms. Something about it tugged at him, a pull from deep within his bones. It was a quiet force, insistent yet unspoken, like the gravity of a dream just before waking. Jacob rose from his seat, drawn forward as if by instinct. With each step his pulse quickened, his breath shallowed. He knew that face. The soft curve of her jaw, the kindness in her eyes, the gentle upturn of her lips. These were not echoes of a stranger. These were memories, not from fleeting dreams or a passing resemblance, but from the photographs he had clung to after the fire. His feet stopped inches from the painting, and the world tilted around him. Sienna Reynolds, his mother. A rush of cold surged through his veins, numbing his fingers, tightening his chest. The twin infants in her arms, he knew them too. Owen was him. The other was Greg, his brother. The boy who had died in the fire that had stolen their mother when they were only 8 years old. Jacob's breath hitched. He had seen this portrait before. It had hung in their modest living room, a silent witness to their childhood, until that night in 1995, when the flames consumed everything. Every belonging, every photograph, every tangible proof of the life they had once had. The fire had taken it all. So how was it here, in this house? How was it still whole, untouched by time, perfectly preserved as though history had never burned it away? Impossible, he whispered, barely hearing his own voice. A flicker of movement behind him made him start. "Mr. Reynolds?" Juliet's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable note of curiosity beneath it. He turned sharply, forcing his expression into something unreadable. She regarded him for a moment before shifting her gaze to the painting. "I see you found one of Mr. Kieran's most treasured pieces," she said. Jacob swallowed, the weight of too many questions pressing against his ribs. "It's interesting," he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. His eyes flicked back to the frame, the black frame that was what his father had always called it, its dark border as distinct as the past it contained, a past that should have been lost forever. Yet here it was, hanging in the mansion of one of New York's wealthiest families, and he had no idea why. "Yes, the black portrait, as the family calls it," Juliet said, her voice even, though her gaze lingered on Jacob a moment longer than necessary. "A sentimental piece for Mr. Kieran, though I don't know the full story behind it. Mrs. Lena, his wife, doesn't care for it much, says it clashes with the rest of the collection." Jacob barely registered her words. His mind was still tangled in the impossible reality of what he was seeing, of what it meant. But before he could press for more details, the sharp click of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall, breaking the moment like glass. A man entered, his presence immediately filling the space with an air of quiet authority. He was tall, his frame draped in a tailored suit that spoke of old wealth, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. His salt and pepper hair was expertly styled, his expression one of cold detachment, the kind honed over generations of privilege. "Juliet," he said, his tone edged with irritation. "Mother is demanding the Sèvres tea set. Apparently, the regular china isn't good enough for her garden club parasites." He barely spared her a glance before his sharp, calculating eyes landed on Jacob. There was a pause, a brief flicker of assessment, as if he were appraising a piece of furniture rather than a man. "And this is?" "Mr. Reynolds, sir," Juliet supplied smoothly. "The restoration specialist for the East Wing. Rowan Rowanson, because who else could this be?" Let his gaze sweep over Jacob with the practiced scrutiny of someone who valued objects over people. "I trust Peterson verified your credentials thoroughly?" Jacob held his ground, offering a polite but firm nod. "Yes, sir. I've restored woodwork for several historical properties in the city, including the Vandermeer estate last year." Rowan's expression barely shifted, but his skepticism was tangible, the kind that couldn't be smoothed over with words alone. "Well, this needs to be done properly," he said coolly. "Many of these pieces date back to the founding of the family fortune. They're irreplaceable." "I understand completely," Jacob replied, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Rowan seemed on the verge of another remark when a figure emerged from the shadowed doorway behind him. Jacob might not have noticed him at first if not for the way the air seemed to shift, how the energy in the room changed, subtle yet undeniable. The man was close to Jacob's age, but that was where the similarities ended. His face bore the unmistakable marks of old burn scars, the right side of his skin uneven, textured by a past no surgeon could erase. His hair was combed forward, partially obscuring the worst of it, but the evidence remained. He wore a simple black suit, formal, understated, the uniform of a chauffeur. Rowan didn't even turn to acknowledge him. "Ah, gee," he said with casual indifference. "Tell Mother her driver is ready when she is. God forbid she walk the 3 blocks to her luncheon." The man remained silent. He simply gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. But in that brief moment, his gaze met Jacob's across the room. And something in it sent a jolt through Jacob's body, recognition. Not the vague familiarity of a passing stranger, not the fleeting sense of having seen someone before. something deeper, something impossible. Jacob's breath hitched, his pulse a fraction too fast. Because he had seen those eyes before, and he had buried the person they belonged to. As G turned to leave, Juliet cleared her throat, her voice measured but expectant. "Sir, I've brought the floor plans. Shall I show Mr. Reynolds to the East Wing now?" Rowan barely glanced her way. "Yes, fine," he said with a dismissive wave. Then, as an afterthought, he added, "Just make sure he understands the value of what he's dealing with, and keep him away from the West Wing entirely. Father is not to be disturbed." Jacob caught the flicker of something unreadable in Juliet's expression before she simply nodded. "Of course, sir." Rowan disappeared down the corridor, his presence lingering in the air like the last note of a discordant melody. Juliet let out a quiet sigh and turned to Jacob with an apologetic look. "Sorry about that. Shall we?" Jacob gave a curt nod, forcing himself to focus, but as they walked, the weight of the discovery gnawed at him. His mother's portrait. The black portrait was here in this house, the impossibility of it pressed against his ribs like a too-tight vice. He kept his voice even, casual. "Juliet, how long has that portrait been in the family?" She glanced at him, considering. "I'm not entirely sure. I've only been here 5 years, but I believe Margot, the housekeeper before me, brought it into the household. She was with the family for decades before I arrived." Jacob's pulse quickened. "Is she still around?" Juliet's expression softened. "No, she passed 2 years ago." Jacob nodded slowly, filing away the information. Margot. A name, a thread, another piece of the puzzle that was his past, inexplicably intertwined with this house. But with her gone, the answers had just become harder to find. Still, he would find them. His gaze flicked back toward the grand hall as they continued toward the East Wing. A creeping sensation of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. Turning slightly, he caught movement from the shadows of a doorway. G, the scarred man, stood just out of the light, watching him, not with idle curiosity, with intent. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes burned with something Jacob couldn't quite name, something like recognition or perhaps warning, like a sentinel guarding secrets that had been buried far too long. 3 days into the restoration, Jacob had settled into a routine. He arrived early, before the household fully stirred, immersing himself in the quiet, methodical work of breathing life back into century-old wood. The East Wing doors bore the weight of decades of neglect, veneer peeling at the edges, intricate carvings dulled beneath layers of the wrong polish, brass fittings tarnished to a lifeless brown. He worked with patience, steady hands, restoring what time had unraveled. But it was the hours after his official workday, the moments when he should have been heading home to Zara, that Jacob found most valuable. Mrs. Kelly, his trusted babysitter, had agreed to extended hours, unaware of what that extra time truly meant to him. It meant freedom to move through the mansion, under the guise of assessing additional restoration needs. It meant stolen moments to search for the missing pieces of a history that had been stolen from him. It meant answers, and he was determined to find them. "You coming home for dinner tonight, Dad?" Zara's voice had been hopeful that morning, her small fingers fumbling with the straps of her oversized Batman backpack. The weight of it made her look even smaller, just 8 years old, yet carrying so much more than she should have to. Jacob had crouched to her level, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. "I'll try, sweetheart. This job is complicated." She had only nodded, the kind of quiet acceptance that made his heart ache. Now, as the afternoon shadows stretched long across the marble floors of Rowanson Mansion, Jacob ran his fingers lightly along the grain of a hallway panel near the library. The air carried the scent of aged wood and lemon polish, a stark contrast to the burning questions smoldering in his mind. This house was a labyrinth of history, its walls whispering secrets he didn't yet understand. But none of those whispers explained why his mother's portrait, the black portrait, hung in the grand hall. He closed his eyes, and the past crashed over him like a breaking wave, pulling him under. The acrid sting of smoke, the unbearable heat, The distant, desperate sound of his father's voice screaming for Sienna and Greg. Jacob had been 8, standing frozen on the front lawn, clutching his stuffed dinosaur as their small home was swallowed by flames. The fire inspector's verdict had been swift and clinical. "Faulty wiring," he had said. But Jacob's father never believed it. "There was nothing wrong with that wiring," Jack Reynolds would mutter, his voice slurred, his hands shaking as he clutched his whiskey glass. "Nothing wrong at all." The drinking got worse. The muttering turned to rambling, and 2 years later, when the state took Jacob away, Jack had knelt in front of his son, his grip unsteady but his eyes fierce with urgency. "Remember the black frame, Jacob," he had said, voice hoarse with something between grief and desperation. "Remember, it was special to your mother. It's not just a painting, it's proof." But proof of what? Jack never explained. Within 5 years, he drank himself to death, leaving 15-year-old Jacob alone in a world that no longer had space for unanswered questions. A voice shattered the silence, yanking Jacob from the depths of memory. "You seem quite interested in the woodwork beyond your assigned area." Lena Rowanson stood at the end of the hallway, her presence as deliberate as the carefully curated antiques that filled her home. Though well into her 60s, she carried herself with the poised authority of a woman who had spent a lifetime shaping the world around her to fit her will, and ensuring others fell in line accordingly. Her tailored cream suit was impeccable, each sharp crease a silent declaration of wealth. Jacob had no doubt that the outfit alone cost more than he made in a month. "Mrs. Rowanson," he greeted, inclining his head in polite acknowledgement, her lips curled into a cold approximation of a smile. "Mr. Reynolds." Jacob kept his stance neutral, professional. The craftsmanship throughout the house is remarkable. As a woodworker, it's impossible not to admire it. "Indeed." Her gaze was unwavering, dissecting, measuring. "Rowan mentioned you were restoring the east wing doors," she said, her voice smooth but edged with quiet scrutiny. "Yet I find you near the library." Jacob met her eyes evenly, offering an easy nod. "Just finishing up for the day. On my way out, I paused to admire the paneling. The level of detail is rare these days." Lena lifted a perfectly manicured hand and dusted an invisible speck from her sleeve. The gesture was slow, deliberate, pointed. "Professional curiosity is one thing, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her tone deceptively light. "But I must insist you remain in your designated areas. This house has been in my husband's family for generations. Many rooms contain valuables that require careful handling." "Of course," Jacob said smoothly. "I apologize if I overstepped." Lena held his gaze for a moment longer before offering the faintest tilt of her head. "No harm done." And yet her tone suggested otherwise. She let the silence linger, stretching it just enough to be uncomfortable, before adding, "I understand you've taken an interest in one of our paintings as well." Jacob's pulse stuttered, but his expression remained composed. "The one in the main hall?" he asked, carefully keeping his tone casual. "The black portrait? It caught my eye. The frame has unique detail." "Yes," Lena said, studying him with the sharpness of a scalpel. "A rather gloomy piece. Kieran insists on displaying it prominently, though it hardly complements the room's aesthetic." Jacob said nothing, waiting. Her eyes never wavered from his face. "Do you have a particular interest in portraiture, Mr. Reynolds?" "Not specifically," he replied evenly. "I just appreciate craftsmanship in all forms." Lena made a soft, non-committal sound. "Well," she said finally, her smile returning, but it held all the warmth of a winter's chill. "I won't keep you. I'm sure your family is waiting." "Just my daughter," Jacob said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He immediately regretted the personal disclosure. "Ah, a single father? Widowed. 3 years now." A flicker of something passed through Lena's expression. Not quite sympathy, more like calculation. "How tragic," she murmured. "Children need a complete family. I raised Rowan alone after his father died, until I met Kieran, of course. It was challenging." Jacob had no desire to linger on this conversation. It was veering into personal territory, and he wasn't about to unpack his grief in the middle of this house, especially not with her. "I should be going," he said smoothly, gathering his tools. "Thank you for your understanding about the woodwork." Lena offered a slow, practiced smile. "Of course." But as he turned, he could feel her gaze lingering on him. There was something unnervingly predatory in the way she watched, like a hawk evaluating whether a creature before it was prey or something more useful. Outside, the crisp evening air was a relief, washing away the oppressive weight of the mansion's walls. No matter how grand, that house carried something heavy within it, something unspoken, something unseen. Jacob exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he walked toward his truck. That was when he noticed the figure standing by a sleek black town car parked a short distance away. The chauffeur moved with quiet efficiency, meticulously polishing the vehicle's surface in slow, practiced strokes. There was an air of precision to his movements, like a soldier performing a routine task. Habit, not thought. Jacob hesitated for only a second before stepping closer. "Evening." Jake looked up, his scarred face momentarily startled. His dark eyes flickered in recognition. Before he gave a single measured nod, he did not speak. Jacob took another step forward, keeping his posture relaxed. "I'm Jacob Reynolds, working on the East Wing restoration." He extended a hand. A simple gesture. An offering. His gaze dropped to it, unreadable. Before he simply turned back to his polishing, Jacob lowered his hand, clearing his throat. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Jake shook his head slightly, then reached into his pocket, retrieving a small notepad and pen. He scribbled something quickly and held it up. "Can't talk, not won't, can't." Jacob blinked. "Oh," he said, caught off guard. "I didn't realize." Jay merely shrugged, then flipped to a fresh page and began writing again. "Burns. Damaged vocal cords long ago." Jacob reread the words, a slow, unsettling chill creeping down his spine. His gaze drifted to the man's scars, deep, jagged remnants of a fire that had once raged just as fiercely as the one in his own memories. Burns scars. The kind that never truly faded. The kind that lived not just on skin, but in the mind. In the silence left behind. M was about his age, Jacob realized. And despite the scarring, his dark hair, his build, there was something almost familiar about him. Jacob's voice was quieter when he spoke again. "Were you born here? At the mansion, I mean?" A flicker of something passed through G's expression. Hesitation, maybe, or caution. Then, slowly, he put pen to paper once more. "Came with Margot after she retired," Jacob frowned. "Margot, the former housekeeper?" G gave a single deliberate nod. "You knew her well?" This time, the nod was firmer, more emphatic. "I've heard she was with the family for decades," Jacob said carefully, watching G's reaction. For a long moment, the chauffeur just studied him, his dark eyes sharp, assessing. Then he exhaled through his nose as if making a decision, and wrote again. "She saved me." The words sent an unexpected jolt through Jacob's chest. Saved him from what? Before he could ask, the mansion's heavy front door swung open, and Rowan's sharp, clipped voice cut through the evening air. "Gee, Mother needs to be at the opera in 30 minutes." The moment between them shattered M's expression, shuddered as he pocketed the notepad and moved swiftly to the driver's seat. Within seconds, the sleek town car rolled down the long, winding driveway, disappearing into the dusk. Jacob remained standing there, a storm gathering in his mind. Marg at the housekeeper who had somehow acquired his mother's portrait. The scarred man with a past tangled in fire and silence. Lena, her veiled hostility, her careful words, her calculating gaze. Jacob climbed into his truck but didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat there, fingers gripping the steering wheel, staring at the looming mansion. Whatever secrets lived within those walls, they were no longer just history. They were reaching for him. He started the engine. His thoughts tangled in the past, but one thing was clear. Zara was waiting. But so were the secrets inside Rowanson Mansion, and he was going to uncover them, no matter what ghosts it awakened. The library smelled of aged paper and leather. Bound volumes, a scent Jacob had always found comforting, but today it felt different. It was Friday afternoon, his 5th day on the job, and for the first time he had the library to himself. The household staff was preoccupied with preparations for an elaborate dinner party. Rowan had taken Kieran to a doctor's appointment. Most importantly, Lena was at her weekly spa visit, which meant at least 2 hours of uninterrupted time. Juliet had passed him in the hallway earlier, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you need anything, I'll be overseeing the catering preparations." There was something in the way she said it. Unspoken permission, perhaps, or a quiet acknowledgement that she knew more than she let on. Now, standing alone in the vast two-story library, Jacob moved methodically along the towering shelves, scanning, searching for what? He wasn't entirely sure. Records, maybe. Old photographs. A clue that explained why his mother's portrait hung in the grand hall of a mansion owned by strangers. A wrought iron spiral staircase led to a second-floor balcony, where more books lined the walls in perfect order. Below, deep leather chairs were arranged in quiet corners, the kind of furniture meant to encourage contemplation. A massive stone fireplace dominated one side of the room, its wooden mantel carved with intricate detailing. Jacob ran his fingers along the cool surface of the wood, tracing the ornate patterns. A piece this elaborate, there was a chance it concealed something. His father had once told him that the wealthiest families of old New York built secrets into their homes, hidden compartments, false panels, a place to tuck away valuables, scandalous letters, or truths too dangerous to leave in the open. But as he ran his hands along the edges, pressing gently, testing the seams, nothing. Solid craftsmanship, no false give. Stepping back, Jacob studied the room again. If he were hiding something, where would he put it? His gaze drifted to the paneled wall behind Kieran's desk. The wood was different there, just subtly enough that most would never notice. A slightly darker hue, a misaligned grain pattern. To the untrained eye, it blended seamlessly with the rest of the room. But to Jacob it stood out like a beacon. Moving closer, he pressed his fingers lightly along the surface, feeling for any weakness. Nothing. He examined the edges, eyes narrowing at the faintest irregularity in the seam on the right side. In his toolbox, he retrieved a thin metal ruler and carefully slid it into the gap. A whisper of resistance, then a soft click. The panel eased open an inch. Heart pounding, Jacob gripped the edge and pulled it wider, revealing a shallow recess no larger than a shoebox. Inside, nestled in the dim space, were two objects. A leather-bound book, its surface worn with time and touch, and a small wooden box adorned with mother-of-pearl inlay. Carefully, he reached for the book first, its spine creaking as he opened it. On the first page, a name was scrawled in flowing ink. The Private Journal of Margot Sullivan, in service to the Rowanson family and Margot, the former housekeeper, the woman who had saved G. The woman Juliet said had died 2 years ago. Jacob flipped to a random page, dated May 14, 1991. Mr. Kieran seemed particularly melancholy today. It's Sienna's birthday. He would never admit it, but I saw him looking at the old photograph he keeps locked in his desk drawer. 32 years she would be now, with her boys not much younger than she was when he cast her out. His pride has cost him so much, yet he cannot bend. Men like Kieran believe their wealth and position grant them dominion over fate itself, yet they are prisoners of their own making. Jacob's grip tightened on the fragile pages. Sienna, his mother's name, and her boys, plural. Him and Greg, he inhaled sharply, turning back through the pages, searching for more. An entry from December 1988 stopped him cold. Visited Sienna and Jack today. The twins are growing so fast, curious little things, always getting into mischief, twins. Jacob's breath came unevenly. Greg hadn't been just his brother. Greg had been his twin. Sienna asked if her father ever mentions her. I couldn't bear to tell her the truth. Mr. Kieran speaks of her only when deep in his cups, and then only to lament his ungrateful daughter who chose a gardener's son over her birthright. How can I tell her that her own father refers to her beautiful boys as the gardener's spawn, yet the pain in his eyes betrays his words? The portrait I commissioned for Sienna and Jack's anniversary hangs in their modest living room. Sienna holding the infant twins in that beautiful black frame Jack crafted. Sometimes I think of the grand portraits in the Rowanson Gallery and wonder if her sons will ever know their true heritage. Jacob's breath hitched, the words blurred on the page as his grip on the journal tightened, knuckles turning white. The walls of the library, lined with centuries of Rowanson history, seemed to close in around him. Kieran Rowanson was Sienna Reynolds's father, which meant... A cold shudder rippled through him. "My God," Jacob whispered, "he's my grandfather." A sound in the hall snapped him from his spiraling thoughts. Footsteps. Approaching. Heart hammering, he shoved the journal back into its hiding place, but the small wooden box still sat in his lap. No time. Without thinking, he slipped it into his tool bag, just as the library door swung open. Rowan. He lingered in the doorway, his gaze sweeping the room, before settling on Jacob with an expression that hardened by the second. "What are you doing in here?" Jacob forced a casual nod toward the ornate ceiling molding. "Measuring for a possible restoration in the east wing. The pattern is almost identical." Rowan's eyes narrowed. "I thought I made it clear you were to stick to your assigned areas. My apologies. Juliet mentioned it was all right to check the molding details since they matched the east wing." A flicker of something, surprise, suspicion, crossed Rowan's face before his expression turned to ice. "Did she?" His voice was dangerously even. "Well, I'm telling you it's not. The library is private, understood?" Jacob nodded, forcing himself to stay composed. "I was just leaving." He gathered his tools, keeping his movements unhurried, measured. Rowan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and, without another word, stepped into the hallway, his voice dropping to a sharp, urgent murmur. Jacob wasted no time. He shouldered his bag and left the library, but his mind was racing. The journal, the black-framed portrait, the truth he was never meant to uncover. And the wooden box now resting against his tools, its weight heavier than it should have been. Taking advantage of the moment, Jacob pressed the panel fully closed and stepped away, smoothing his expression into neutrality as he moved toward the door. As he passed Rowan, fragments of the younger man's hushed conversation reached his ears. "Don't care how you do it, just make it look like..." Rowan's gaze flicked up, catching sight of Jacob. In an instant, his voice shifted to a crisp, professional tone. "Yes, as I was saying, the quarterly report should be on my desk by Monday, thank you." Jacob offered a polite nod and continued down the hallway, but his mind churned with the implications of what he had just uncovered. If Kieran Rowanson was truly Sienna's father, it meant the powerful patriarch had disowned his own daughter, Jacob's mother, and erased any acknowledgement of his grandsons. But why? And how had the black-framed portrait survived the fire that killed Sienna and Greg? Lost in thought, Jacob nearly collided with Juliet as she rounded the corner. "Mr. Reynolds, I was looking for you." Her gaze flicked toward Rowan's retreating figure before settling on Jacob, her expression taut with unspoken meaning. "Is everything all right?" "Fine, just a misunderstanding about where I should be working." Juliet lowered her voice. "Be careful around Mr. Rowan, he's protective of the family's privacy." "I noticed." Jacob hesitated before asking, "Juliet, did you know Margot Sullivan well?" Something flickered across her face. Recognition, caution. "She was my aunt, actually. She got me this position after she retired." Jacob blinked. An unexpected connection. "Your aunt? Did she ever mention a portrait?" Juliet's lips parted slightly. "The black portrait?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Not to me directly, but I overheard her once talking to G. Something about it being proof of birthright. I never understood what she meant." Before Jacob could press for more, a commotion erupted from the front of the house. Sharp voices, a crash of breaking glass. Jacob and Juliet exchanged a glance. Then, without a word, they both moved toward the sound. They hurried toward the noise, stepping into a scene of chaos in the entrance hall. Rowan stood at the center, his face flushed with anger, pointing an accusatory finger at Jacob's open toolbox, which had somehow been moved from the east wing to the main hallway. Beside it, a silver statuette, delicate, unmistakably valuable, lay on the marble floor. "I caught him red-handed." Rowan's voice rang through the hall as he addressed a uniformed security guard. "This priceless Tiffany piece was in his tools. He's been stealing from us." Jacob's breath caught. "That's impossible. I've never seen that statue before." "Search his bag," Rowan ordered, eyes gleaming with triumph. The guard hesitated, then reached for Jacob's tool bag. Jacob's pulse hammered, not because of the statue, he was innocent of that, but inside his bag lay the small wooden box he had taken from Margot's hiding place. If anyone saw it now, he wouldn't have time to understand what it contained before someone else decided its fate. "This is absurd," Jacob protested, forcing his voice steady before the guard could unzip the bag. Movement at the doorway caught Jacob's attention. Silent as ever, the scarred man stepped forward, tablet in hand. Without a word, he approached Rowan and turned the screen toward him. Rowan's eyes flicked to the display, then his face drained of color. "Where did you get this?" His voice was quieter now, edged with something dangerously close to fear. He tapped the screen again, showing more. For a moment the room was utterly still. Then Rowan exhaled sharply. "Fine," he snapped, tearing his gaze away. He turned to the security guard. "False alarm. The statue must have fallen accidentally." The guard blinked in confusion but nodded, stepping back. Rowan shot Jacob a venomous look before storming off, G following at a measured distance. Jacob exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "What just happened?" he asked Juliet when they were alone. She looked as baffled as he felt. "I have no idea, but G just saved you from serious trouble." A pause, then lower. "He's never done anything like that before, for anyone." As Juliet returned to her duties, Jacob knelt to retrieve his toolbox, his thoughts spinning. He needed to examine the box from Margot's hiding place. Not here, not now. The stakes had just changed. Rowan had tried to frame him, and G, for reasons Jacob didn't yet understand, had just saved him. That evening, as Jacob drove home, the wooden box rested heavily in his bag. A silent weight, a tether to a past that refused to stay buried. The secrets he had unearthed were no longer just whispers in the dark. They were real, tangible, and they had already put a target on his back. Unseen in the fading light, a sleek black town car eased away from the curb, its headlights off, its presence a shadow in the deepening dusk. It followed patient, unwavering whelp. The kitchen table in Jacob's modest Queens apartment was nearly invisible beneath the carefully arranged relics of a past he was only beginning to piece together. After tucking Zara into bed, securing a promise of pancakes in the morning, he had emptied Margot's wooden box with meticulous care, spreading its contents before him in a rough chronology. Faded photographs, newspaper clippings, birthday cards, each signed with a familiar warmth. "Love, Margot, to my dear Sienna." But the most damning artifacts were the letters, written in a firm, elegant script, each one signed, "Your father, Kieran." Jacob held one up to the light, dated June 1981, Sienna. "Your mother's pearls are enclosed. I couldn't bear to see Lena wearing them, knowing they were meant for you on your wedding day. This is all I can offer. Do not contact me again. You've made your choice, and I've made mine, the gardener's boy. He may have your heart, but he will never provide the life you deserve. I've instructed the family lawyers to honor your request, to remove your name from all Rowanson documents. As far as society is concerned, you are no longer my daughter. Perhaps someday you'll understand that bloodlines and reputation are the only true currencies in this world. Your father, Kieran." Jacob set the letter down, his pulse drumming in his ears. His mother had been cast out like a stain on the Rowanson name, disowned for the crime of loving a man beneath her station, stripped of her identity, her inheritance, her father's regard. Kieran Rowanson had not simply abandoned his daughter, he had erased her. Beneath the letters, a birth announcement lay nestled in tissue paper, carefully preserved. Sienna and Jack Reynolds joyfully announced the birth of their twin sons, Jacob Michael and Graham Thomas Reynolds. Born April 11, 1986, a photograph accompanied it, the same image captured in the black portrait but stripped of its grandeur. Just a simple, candid snapshot. His mother, weary yet radiant, cradling two newborns in matching hospital caps. His father's familiar handwriting on the back, "Our family complete at last." The portrait that now hung in the Rowanson mansion was a fabrication, a formalized version of this deeply personal moment. The timeline was taking shape. Sienna Reynolds, born Sienna Rowanson, had been Kieran's only daughter. She had defied her father to marry Jack Reynolds, the gardener's son, and paid the ultimate price. Disinherited, cast out, left to build a life beyond the walls of Rowanson wealth and power, Margot the housekeeper had remained the one fragile bridge between Sienna and her past. But then came the fire. Jacob sifted through more letters, searching for anything from that time. Most were quiet updates from Margot to Sienna, ordinary, warm, full of a care that Kieran had never shown, and then something different. A single sheet of Rowanson estate stationery, its edges torn as though it had been yanked from a notepad in haste. The ink, hurried, nearly frantic. SL knows about our visits, not safe, heard her on phone with cousin F, planning something. Stay alert. We'll come tonight to discuss. Jacob exhaled sharply. SLA had to be Lena, but who was F? And what exactly had they been planning that left Margot so concerned? His gaze drifted back to the photograph of his mother, frozen in time, smiling down at the sons who never had the chance to know her. Something dark coiled in his chest. This wasn't just about a portrait, it was about murder. A faint tapping sound made Jacob's pulse spike. Someone was at his apartment door. It wasn't a forceful knock, just a soft, hesitant rap, the kind that wouldn't wake Zara. Quickly, he swept the documents back into Margot's wooden box and slid it beneath the couch before moving cautiously to the door. Through the peephole, he spotted Juliet standing in the dimly lit hallway, her posture tense. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear behind her. Jacob unlatched the door. "Juliet, how did you find me?" She slipped inside before answering, shutting the door firmly behind her. "Jake told me." Jacob blinked. "G?" She nodded, eyes still flicking toward the windows, the corners of the room. Anywhere danger might lurk. "May I sit?" He gestured toward the couch, though she remained standing. "I'm sorry for showing up like this," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "But after what happened today with Rowan, and then seeing G follow you, I had to warn you." Jacob stiffened. "G followed me?" "He does that sometimes," Juliet murmured. "Mrs. Lena orders him to watch people, track them in the town car. But tonight was different." Jacob's mind raced. "How?" She hesitated. "He came back early. Didn't report to her. Went straight to his quarters without a word. That wasn't like G." Jacob exhaled slowly, studying Juliet's expression. "Why are you really here?" She twisted her hands together, hesitating before finally speaking. "My Aunt Margot raised me after my parents died. She was more mother than aunt to me. Before she passed, she made me promise something." Juliet swallowed hard. "She told me to watch over G," a pause, "and to help the sons when they return." Jacob frowned. "Sons?" Juliet nodded. Something cold slid down his spine. "She didn't say son," she said. "Sons." Juliet's words settled over Jacob like a lead weight. "I think she meant you and someone else." He sank onto the couch, his mind spinning. "My twin brother Greg died in the fire with my mother, at least that's what I was told." Juliet hesitated. "Are you certain of that?" Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but his phone buzzed. A new message unknown. "Number watch your back. Rowan making calls, digging into your background." G. He turned the screen toward Juliet. "Seems your aunt's protege is looking out for me. Why would he do that?" Juliet stared at the text, her expression darkening. "I don't know. G never communicates with anyone, except through notes, and only when absolutely necessary. He's never sent a text, as far as I know." Jacob studied her face. What happened to him? The scars? His inability to speak? Juliet lowered her gaze. Aunt Margot would only say he survived something terrible. He showed up at the mansion about 10 years ago after Margot retired. Kieran took him in as a favor to her, though Lena was furious. Jacob absorbed that. Another unanswered question in a growing list. "Juliet, I need to see Margot's journal again. There are still too many missing pieces." "It's too dangerous for you to go back to the library," she warned. "Rowan will be watching." "Then you'll have to help me," Jacob said. "There must be more entries around the time of the fire. Margot knew something was coming. She warned my mother about Lena and someone called F." Juliet went pale. "Frederick," she whispered. "Lena's cousin." Jacob's pulse kicked up. "You know him?" "Of him," she corrected. "He's done odd jobs for the family over the years, always paid in cash, never through official channels." She hesitated, then added, "Aunt Margot called him Lena's fixer." A cold shiver traced down Jacob's spine. "What kind of jobs?" "I don't know specifics, but nothing good," Juliet admitted. "He disappeared years ago, until recently. I saw him meeting with Lena in the garden 2 days ago." Jacob's unease deepened. If Lena's fixer was suddenly back, just as he was unearthing family secrets, it couldn't be a coincidence. "Listen," Juliet said urgently. I need to get back before I'm missed. But there's something else you should know." She hesitated. "Kieran is very ill, worse than the family lets on. He's been meeting with his lawyers frequently, and Lena is panicking about something. I've overheard arguments about the will." Jacob's pulse quickened. "He's changing it?" "I think so, and there's more." Juliet glanced toward the door, lowering her voice. "The night before last I heard him talking to G. He called him Graham." Jacob's breath caught, his mind reeled. "You think G is—" A soft creak from the hallway froze them both. They turned to see Zara standing there in her dinosaur pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy, who's talking?" Jacob forced a calm smile. "Just a friend from work, sweetheart. Go back to bed." Zara blinked at Juliet, studying her with sleepy curiosity, before nodding and padding back to her room. Juliet exhaled softly. "I should go." She stepped toward the door, then turned back, her expression shadowed. "Be careful, Jacob. If Rowan is investigating you, it won't take much to connect you to Sienna Reynolds. Once Lena knows who you really are." Jacob met her gaze. What would she do? Juliet hesitated, her voice turning grave. "Lena has spent 30 years as Mrs. Kieran Rowanson. She's not about to let long-lost grandchildren threaten her position or her inheritance." Her hand touched the doorknob, but she didn't turn it. "There's a safe in Kieran's study," Juliet murmured, "behind the painting of the sailboat. If there's proof of your connection to the family, it might be there." After she left, Jacob remained in the dimly lit living room, his mind racing. If G was Graham, his twin brother, somehow rescued from the fire, why had he never come forward? Why remain hidden in the shadows of the Rowanson estate? And if Kieran was rewriting his will, potentially to include newly discovered grandchildren, how far would Lena go to protect her claim to the fortune? As if in answer, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Old man asking questions about you. Said your name in his sleep." Lena heard. "Be ready." Jacob exhaled sharply. Damn it! Across the street, the low hum of an engine reached his ears. He moved to the window just in time to see a black sedan pulling away, its taillights vanishing into the night. "Can I come with you today, Dad, please?" Zara bounced on her toes beside the kitchen counter, her backpack already strapped on. Despite it being Saturday, Mrs. Kelly is nice, but she smells like cough drops, and her TV only gets boring channels. Jacob flipped the last pancake onto a plate, considering his daughter's request. Given how tangled things were becoming, but leaving her behind while unknown threats circled wasn't much better. "The place I'm working is pretty fancy," he hedged, "not really kid-friendly." "I'll be super good," Zara promised, her dark eyes wide with sincerity. "I brought my sketch pad and my library book. I won't touch anything expensive." Jacob studied her hopeful face, the determined set of her jaw, the unwavering gaze. Sometimes she looked so much like Sienna it stole his breath. He sighed. "Hell!" "All right," he relented. "But you stay where I can see you, okay?" Zara's triumphant grin lit up her face, making Jacob smile despite the unease curling in his gut. An hour later, Jacob pulled up to the Rowanson mansion. He had texted Juliet about bringing Zara, and she had arranged for them to enter through the service entrance. Lena was hosting a charity committee meeting in the main part of the house, and it was best to avoid her. "Whoa," Zara whispered as they stepped inside. "It's like a castle." Juliet met them in the rear hallway, her smile softening as she took in the little girl's wide-eyed wonder. "I've set up a spot for you in the conservatory," she said. "It has the most beautiful light for drawing." As they wove through the back corridors, Jacob kept Zara close, his senses sharpening with every shift of light and rustle of movement. Something about the house felt off, as if the walls themselves were aware of his presence. The conservatory, however, was a surprising contrast, a sun-drenched room with towering windows overlooking a private garden. Potted palms and flowering plants softened the space, and on a small table sat a neatly arranged collection of drawing supplies, alongside a plate of cookies. "This is perfect," Jacob murmured. "Thank you." "Mr. Kieran rarely comes here, and Mrs. Lena avoids it entirely. Something about the humidity affecting her hair," Juliet said with a knowing smile. "You should be undisturbed." Once Zara was settled, Jacob lowered his voice. Any news about the journal? Juliet cast a cautious glance toward the hallway before slipping him a folded paper. I couldn't get into the library, she admitted, but I copied some entries from memory, dates around the fire. Jacob pocketed the note, nodding his thanks. And Kieran? Doctor's visit this morning. He's worse, she said hesitantly, and he's been asking about the black portrait. He wanted it moved to his bedroom. Before Jacob could respond, a soft knock sounded at the conservatory door. Mingus stood in the doorway, his scarred face partially obscured by the shadows. His sharp gaze flickered from Jacob to Zara, widening slightly as he took her in. "Zir Juliet," greeted calmly. "This is Zara, Mr. Reynolds' daughter." Zara looked up at the imposing figure, momentarily startled by his appearance, but then curiosity won out. "Hi, I like your suit. You look like you drive important people around." Z inclined his head in a small, almost formal bow. Zara giggled. He pulled out his notepad and scribbled something before holding it up for her to read. "I like your drawing," Zara read aloud, then brightened. "Thanks. It's our apartment, but I added a tower. Dad says real apartments don't have towers, but I think they should." Jay's lips curved, just slightly, in what might have been a smile. He wrote again and showed her. "Every home should have a tower," Zara read, her grin widening. "See, Dad? He gets it." Jacob watched the exchange, an odd tightness forming in his chest. The way G looked at Zara, there was something almost familiar in his expression, something deeper than mere politeness. Juliet spoke gently. "G, is Mr. Kieran back from his appointment?" G nodded, then scribbled a longer note before passing it to Jacob. "Kieran asking for you, says he recognizes your craftsmanship. Private meeting requested. Lena furious. Be careful." Jacob exchanged a wary glance with Juliet. When G was already writing again. "I'll take you," he wrote. "Juliet will watch the girl." Jacob crouched beside Zara. "I need to go with G for a bit, work stuff. You okay staying with Juliet?" Zara rolled her eyes. "Duh, Dad, we're gonna have cookies and talk about towers." Jacob followed G through a series of back corridors, their path winding up a narrow service staircase. The stark contrast between these unadorned passages and the lavish main halls of the mansion was striking, a silent reminder of the divide between the Rowanson family and those who served them. At the second floor, G stopped before an imposing mahogany door, gesturing for Jacob to wait. He knocked softly, then slipped inside, leaving Jacob alone in the dimly lit hallway. For a moment, Jacob traced the intricate carvings on the door, his fingers running over the ridges and swirls. His father had once told him that wood carried memory, that its rings recorded years of abundance and hardship, that knots marked traumas endured, that even after cutting, sanding, and polishing, its essence remained unchanged. The door creaked open and G motioned for him to enter. As Jacob steps through the doorway, the weight of generations bears down on him. The man on the other side, the patriarch who erased his own daughter, holds the key to answers Jacob never dared to hope for. But will Kieran Rowanson reveal the truth freely? Or is there a deeper game at play, with deadly consequences? One thing is certain, Jacob isn't the only one searching for answers. Lena watches from the shadows. Rowan plots in silence, and G, his silent protector, may hold the biggest secret of all. And if Jacob's long-lost twin brother is truly alive, then why has he remained hidden for decades? The past isn't just knocking, it's demanding to be uncovered. Dawn Miss Part 2, where family secrets collide, old betrayals resurface, and Jacob finally faces the man who might have all the answers, or all the power, to destroy him. Subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. What do you think is hidden in Kieran's safe? Drop your theories in the comments below.